ladies and gentlemen.
Here comes the music.
All right, welcome back. So as most of you are probably aware, this year at ICAST, Shimano released the SLX DC to the North American market. So I've got one right here. Got one of the first ones that shipped, just because I happen to be quick ordering, not because I've got any special affiliation with anybody. But they announced it, and I immediately found somewhere that had them available to order. I ordered them and got one of the first batches that shipped. So there's the SLX DC, and then last year at ICAST they released the Curado DC to the U.S. market, and I've been fishing this one ever since. I've got 3 of these reels. I really liked them, and I was excited to find a less expensive reel that had the DC technology in it, which at the time this was released, this was the least expensive DC reel Shimano had ever produced. So fast forward a year, and now they've got a DC technology reel under $200. And well, I was like, okay, the SLX was already probably the best reel in its price category at $100. So now for a sub $200 reel, does the SLX DC really have what it takes? Does it bring, is it worth your money? So let's tear these 2 reels apart, see what the SLX DC and the Curado DC both have to offer internally. All right. So on the American market, you've got 2 different versions of the DC system that are out right now. The Metanium DC has what they call IDC5, which is a really flexible, really adjustable DC braking system. When the Curado was released, it was released with the IDC4. And it's 4 positions on the dial here. One is kind of minimal braking. It acts a lot like just a normal bait caster. 2 is the setting for braid and for mono, so it's a little less braking. Those lines cast a bit easier. 3 is the fluorocarbon setting, so a little bit more aggressive braking profile. And then 4 is the most aggressive braking profile, specifically designed for throwing light baits into the wind or trying, skipping baits, that kind of stuff. So IDC4 on the Curado, and the exact same IDC4 system in the SLX DC. So what's the difference? Let's tear them apart and find out. All right, so here are the 2 reels sitting in front of me, torn down. We got the Curado DC over here on the right. Got the SLX DC on the left. So tearing them apart, looking at the differences between them. Both of them have a clicking star drag. It's an aluminum star drag on the Curado, and it is a polymer plastic star drag on the SLX. The big thing I noticed with the SLX, I think this is an absolutely horrible design for a reel, but this is just my personal preference. It only really matters if you ever take the reel apart. There's your clicker right there. So there's a little tiny detent pin. If you look right there, a little tiny detent pin, and there's a spring underneath it, and then that engages with the little teeth on this washer that sits underneath the reel handle. So I've already lost this pin twice in the last 10 minutes, in the spring especially as well, because it's a little tiny thing. So just be really careful of that when you take the thing apart. But in both cases, the star drag indexes to a nut, and then the nut tightens down over the main shaft of the reel, which then compresses some Belleville washers and puts pressure on the sleeve here through the anti-reverse clutch, and then puts pressure on your clutch stack, or your drag stack. So essentially, mechanically, these 2 reels are identical. Same drag system, a lot of the same components, and let's look at the 2 big differences. All right. So once again, on the left, we have the SLX DC main gear, and on the right, we've got the Curado DC main gear. Drive plates are the same size. There's a little bit extra space inside the gear on the Curado. The Curado gear is physically bigger around, as you can see. These are the same gear ratio reel. They're both 7.3. They're both 7.3 to 1s. And the gearing on the gear teeth, if you look here, on the Curado are ever so slightly smaller, and the gear's a little tiny bit. Feels like it's a little bit tiny bit thinner, but I don't think it is. But you got slightly smaller teeth on the Curado for the micro module gears. They say that it makes for a smoother reel, and you got more teeth engaged. And I think it's mostly marketing, personally. But what that does create, though, is a situation where the gear mesh becomes that much more important. Because the smaller teeth, they're not cut as deep. There's not as much depth engaged between the main gear and the pinion this way. So if the gears get pushed apart just a little bit, it doesn't have to move very far under load at all before the gears start skipping and stripping, which has been a problem that I've heard about, at least. I haven't experienced it with mine, with the Metaniums, with their micro module gearing, just because they use an aluminum main gear to save weight. Well, what that aluminum does, just because of the way it's designed, it's still got these cutouts in it, and the aluminum's not as rigid as the brass is, so the aluminum itself flexes, the gear flexes. Both the main gear and the pinion gear will flex and mess up the mesh, and they've developed a bit of a reputation for stripping gears, which isn't a good thing. So how's that accounted for on this reel? So if we look at the SLX, the shaft, whoops, that wasn't good. So if you look at the SLX, the shaft for the spool goes through the pinion, and the pinion rides on that shaft. So when you press the thumb bar to disengage the clutch, it pulls the pinion out here, disengages the drive dog. Not that big a deal. As part of their Hagane design, one thing Shimano has done is there is a ball bearing in here that the pinion rides on, and that helps support the spool shaft. So you end up with the spool shaft riding on 3 ball bearings. You've got the bearing in the outside side plate, so down in there. You've got this bearing here, and then you've got the bearing on the handle side plate under the spool tension. So that's part of their Hagane. What the Curado DC does a little bit differently to make it where these gears are actually viable. If they put these gears in the SLX, they'd strip the gears out under load pretty easily, just because it allows for too much flex. What you end up with is the spool shaft goes all the way through the pinion the same way. However, in addition to the ball bearing that's in the reel side plate here, or in the reel frame here for this pinion gear, there's also another ball bearing. So there's 2 ball bearings in the side plate here. So the bigger one fits over this shaft here, or this section of the pinion gear, to provide support for the pinion gear, to keep the pinion gear itself from moving. For the gear mesh to get messed up in this thing, essentially you'd have to have the frame flex here enough, or this gear flex enough, or this whole assembly here flex enough. So all this big hunk of brass tube with the gear on it flex to adjust the gear mesh. So as far as having these little gears, and they really did this they had to do this to account for it, to keep these gears from stripping out easily. So this should be a pretty durable reel. I'm not too concerned about durability on this thing at all. So. The other thing I noticed taking this Curado DC apart is this screw right here, which goes in right behind the thumb bar. Is actually one of the screws that holds the reel together. So this one's kind of a tricky one. So don't forget that one. The other thing is there are 4 screws on each of them that hold the side plate to the frame. On the Curado, all 4 of them come from the inside and thread into the plastic side plate. So this is their proprietary CI4, whatever, C4I, whatever they want to call it. Their carbon reinforced plastic side plate. I mean, it is what it is. It's nothing special. But all 4 of the screws thread into that. On the SLX, you've got 2 right here that come in from the outside. Those thread into the metal frame, so they're a fine pitch screw, a machine screw. And then you've got 2 that come in from the outside or from the inside as well that are more of a coarse thread, like sheet metal type screw. Like I said, it's not that big a deal. It doesn't really affect much of anything, but just something to be conscious of. Here's what I was looking for. And then on the Curado, I also noticed that there was a copper shim underneath the Belleville washers, between the Belleville washers and the thrust bearing. So. And the way this whole thing goes together is this is a Teflon washer. So this metal on one side is Teflon on the other side, so this will pivot fairly freely and won't bind up. This nut threads down over this whole assembly here, and you kind of got to hold the level wind in place. So that nut threads down here, and then when you turn the star drag sits on this, or indexes on this, and this can move up and down inside the star drag. As you tighten this down, it compresses those 2 Belleville washers together and applies pressure onto your drag stack. So put the nut in, put the spring in, and then what you got to keep in mind here is this thing sits, you'll get it pivoted around until it slips on. There it goes. So now it's indexed onto that nut, and you got to hold this under pressure while you put the handle back on, because this spring loaded, as you can see there. So re-index it, hold it down, slide the handle on, hold the handle until you can get this nut started. Standard 10mm. Snug this down, it'll compress that spring for you. Make sure everything works right. Yep, seems to be working right. And then we'll put the locking piece over it. So. What I noticed is this one, the Curado had some red thread lock on this screw, though it didn't act like normal red thread lock. And the SLX had some blue thread lock on it, so not that big a deal, but there's that. The spools between the 2 reels are identical. Best I can tell, they're probably actually even interchangeable. They're just different colors. The disassembly is a little bit different for the side plate. So on the Curado DC, you've got the auto or the open position here, and it opens up a little tab there that holds that goes over that locking pin, so it allows you to open up the reel. As long as you've got the brake set in one of the positions, this cover's locked on. I got something screwed up in here. I'll have to tear this thing apart in a minute. I Put the SLX back together. So the pawl here that re-engages your thumb bar through that right there, it's square keyed, and the bottom of the shaft is square keyed as well. So first thing you gotta do is, when you put the main gear back on, line that up until that indexes with the shaft. And you can put the main gear back on. Make sure it engages with the pinion, and then this thing's domed. Make sure the dome side's up, and that indexes to the shaft as well. All right, from there, got our 2 springs. And I'm going to push this piece out right here just to make it easier to line everything up. Okay, so something else I just noticed is the Curado has got another ball bearing right here to help support the main shaft. The SLX just has the interverse clutch bearing, so the roller bearing there. So, you know, one more thing as part of the X ship, just to add a little more strength to keep the main shaft from flexing and messing up the gear mesh, because the gear mesh is so critical on that Curado DC with those micro module gears. So set this back on, make sure everything's lined up, and clicks into place. There we go. So like I said, we got 2 machine screws that come in from the outside. They're little tiny things. So these thread into the metal, and they're the same size. So that one there, one here. And just something to keep in mind whenever you're working on a reel. There's no reason to crank down on these fasteners at all. Just finger tight is all you need. If you go any tighter than that, you run the risk of starting to strip things. So be real careful and conscious of that. All right, the shorter screw goes out on the nose piece here, or out towards the nose, I should say. And then the longer screw goes up underneath the reel. All right, so the handle on this one, so we got our Belleville washers going first. There's not a shim under this one because there's no ball bearing there. So got our Belleville washers. This is our Teflon, the Teflon washer here. So make sure that it's copper on one side, it's Teflon on the other. Make sure the Teflon side is facing up, because that's what allows this nut to turn freely. Thread this nut down on here. Put our spring on, and then I've got the washer sitting on top here so I don't lose that stupid detent, but it's going to pop loose on me, or at least try to, as I try and get all this sitting on here. So probably the easiest thing to do at this point is dump all that out so I know where it all is. So I've got my little tiny spring there, my little tiny detent, that washer. Now I don't have to worry about it flying across the room. If I lose this piece, hold this down, drop that little tiny spring in there, put the little tiny detent in there, slide this washer on top, get the reel handle on top there, and now it should hold, now it'll stay in place while I put the nut on. what you'll find with a lot of these is you got to tweak the position of that nut so this piece drops on and the screw hole lines up. And then once again, run the line through there real quick. Make sure the line's not hung up. So on this reel, there's not an open position. So you can set the brakes however you want them. There's a little lever right here to open and close the side plate. So with the lever back at night, it sits in nice and flush. And the side plate's locked in place. You flip it forward, and it rotates just a little bit to unlock. So there's the SLX. All right, so what's all that mean? What's the bottom line? I've fished both of these reels. I've fished the Curado DC extensively over the last year, and I just spent a weekend on the water with the SLX DC on my frog rod at Clear Lake. If you watch my Clear Lake video, the fish I show in that video catching the frog, I was using the SLX DC. Going forward, which one gets my money? I'm buying the SLX DC. On the water performance, I cannot tell a difference. The Curado DC might, in theory, at least be a little bit smoother, but there's quality gears in the SLX DC, and the gear mesh isn't quite as critical. Now, one of my Curado DCs is already getting a little bit gritty in the retrieve. The SLX DC with the bigger gears just seems to me like it's going to be a little bit more durable in that regard. There's extra ball bearings in the Curado, and for the Curado, it makes sense where they are. But the SLX isn't lacking in that regard. It's got the right ball bearings where it needs them for the design of the reel. Like I said, it stays perfectly smooth. It stayed perfectly smooth and didn't give me any grief under a heavy load either. So if I've got more to buy at any point, I'm buying the SLX DC. Now that said, stay tuned for another video and I'll show you where I'll really end up spending my money as far as DC reels going forward. But between the SLX DC and the Curado DC, no real noticeable difference in casting, no noticeable difference on retrieve. I bought them in the same gear ratio specifically to test them out. I was using them on the same rod, same line, and my vote goes to this SLX DC. All right. Well, hey, if you like this video, give it a thumbs up. If you want to see some more technical videos, comment down below. There will be more to come. I'll be tearing into some more Daiwa reels, and I've got another video coming out soon. I've got another video coming out soon that's going to show what I consider a more worthy use of your money compared to the Curado DC. So, till next time, cheers and tight lines.